It was September, and the clouds were slate gray. It had been 3 weeks of on and off rain, which wasn't ordinary for this time of year. My brother and I tried to keep ourselves entertained, playing board games meant for 3 or more players, watching cartoons, facing off in Rock'em Sock'em Robots. The last time Kai had gone out in the rain, he came back with a fever of 102. My mom was adamant that it didn't happen again. That, and we always tracked in mud and made a mess of the place. So we were prisoners in our own home. One afternoon, my mom had to go out for the day. It was raining especially hard, I remember. She said she'd call, and we better be there to answer the phone. There was absolutely no leaving the house. We agreed, fingers crossed behind our backs, of course. Once she had gone, we quickly put on our jackets and boots and went outside into the rainstorm. We'd moved to this neighborhood only a few months prior, and one thing we loved to do was explore, play fantasy that we were space travelers exploring some new and uninhabited planet. There were woods in the area behind our house, but they quickly gave way to more neighborhoods of cookie-cutter homes, all built the same. To be honest, to this day, I wouldn't be able to find my way out of that neighborhood. We were dead center in a suburban sprawl. When my mom drove us to school, I never paid much attention to the rights and lefts, but we must have turned 12 or 13 times before getting onto any sort of main road. My brother and I decided to play Noah's Ark. We had a long delivery box that we stood in the center of at waist height and pretended to paddle as we splashed through the gutters, soaked through with rainwater. Distant thunder grumbled, and I remember seeing my brother's eyes go wide, but in a playful way like, uh-oh, there's a mighty squall afoot. We continued our adventure up the street and around a corner onto a nearby road we hadn't been down before. These were the moments of memory, where we saw new things, ventured into new lands. It was the late hours of morning, maybe 11 a.m. Something I found odd was that all the houses had no lights on. Not just porch lights, but the lights inside. It was all dark. No cars drove by. It was Sunday, so I assumed people had gone to church. Still, it made the adventure feel all the more desolate. Immersion gripped me, and we paddled on, looking for signs of life in this strange land. We took shelter in a culvert, down a ditch where rainwater cascaded, forming a small waterfall. We discussed our mission log, what sort of alien planet this was. Our boat was in disrepair, and we'd surely need to make repairs when we got back to the station. My brother was laughing. I don't think I'd ever seen him so carefree, so jubilant. Even for a 7-year-old, he always seemed rigid and anxious. Then I spotted something behind him, deeper in the darkness of the pipe. 2 yellow eyes, staring. My brother had his back turned to it, but he looked at me with dread, anxiety. He could read whatever it was on my face. He went to turn, but I quickly changed the subject, assuring him that more discoveries awaited us, that we had to keep moving. I dragged him by my end of the box, out of the culvert, and back into the wet world beyond. We were so caught up in our adventure that I stopped recognizing where we were at all. I was used to navigating by landmarks rather than street signs. My brain interpreted symbols much better than words. But in my neighborhood, and the neighborhoods neighboring my neighborhood, all was the same. Cars parked in garages, each house had the same hedges, the same walkways, the same shutters. Outside the game, it was starting to feel all too real, like this was a place devoid of life entirely. Just cut and paste. We tried circling back. I put on a brave face for my younger brother, acting like I knew where we were going, but I was lost. Completely lost. I knew we were in trouble when we arrived at a small park, nestled in the center of some houses. Even the playground lacked any sort of personality. It was pristine, as if the instruments of fun had never been used. The slide shone in the slick of rainwater, a puke green color matching the jungle gym and monkey bars. My brother was ecstatic to have found this gem in the otherwise boring neighborhood, and climbed the rails to use the tube slide turned water slide. I smiled and encouraged him, as I thought to myself about where we'd gone wrong, how to find our way back. The rain had dimmed the sky more than it should have for the time of day, and I couldn't tell how long we'd been out anymore. Kai went down the slide, his excited scream echoing through the dark chasm within. The rain kept falling. Water ran steadily off the plastic lip of the slide. I waited. Longer than I should have before calling his name. I called it once, then again. Where was he? Was he stuck inside? I panicked and called louder. Then he came out of the end silent, white as a sheet. I asked if he was okay. He was crying silently. He said politely, in a heartbreaking sort of way, that he'd like to go home now. I asked what happened. He simply yawned and said he was cold, but I could tell something had shaken him. He was soaked through. His poncho and rubber boots had done nothing for his jeans, which were waterlogged and sodden through. I told him we would head back now. Our cardboard boat had fallen apart, lying in a pile of mush on the sidewalk. We left it there and tried to head back home. I turned to check on Kai, but from the playground where we came, in the darkness of the slide, I swear I saw two yellow eyes staring at me. They were wider now, less like a cat, more human. We walked for what felt like miles to no avail. Nothing was familiar. I knew we were in trouble. Kai was shivering, and I was also uncomfortable, my clothes sour with wet and sweat. The fun was over. Kai began to cry. I assured him we'd get back. I went to the door of the first house I saw and rang the doorbell, if only to get directions or a heading. I knew our street, Ridgemont Ave. If someone could point us that way, I could figure out the rest. But we were kids, and there was the obvious concern that an adult would see us in our state and blow the whole thing out of proportion. Then my mom would erupt when she found out. I told myself it didn't matter. We needed help. No one answered the door. I noticed all the lights were out. They must not have been home. But after 3 or 4 houses with the same result, I started to wonder if anyone actually lived on the street. Were these homes all staged, just shells? Was this some nuke town, a model neighborhood left vacant throughout? We went on further. My brother stopped crying. That moment when the body runs out of juice, and you find yourself walking, staring at your shoes, just taking it one step after another. I looked up and noticed the short stretch of woodland beside us. I wondered about the animals that once lived here before the development, where they had gone, whether they accepted their fate or died on a pilgrimage to some other forest. Yellow eyes blinked in the brush. Another set of eyes appeared a few yards away, then another. It looked like a colony of fireflies, the eyes bobbing up and down unnaturally. I know this doesn't make sense, but something about those eyes were knowing. They were predatory like an animal's, but curious like a human. I nearly pointed them out to my brother, but didn't want to make things worse. I kept my own eyes forward and held his hand tighter, all the while seeing those eyes in my peripheral grow in number. That's when a blinding flash of light crossed my face. A cop car had pulled up. A stocky man in uniform beckoned us inside. By the time we got home, the rain had slowed and it was fully dark. It was nearly 10 p.m. My mother's face was streaked with mascara, swollen red from crying. She hugged both of us in a crushing grip, squeezing us together. Kai came down with a fever after that night. This time he ended up in the hospital. When I saw him, he was hallucinating, writhing, speaking in tongues. I wasn't allowed to see him again until he came home. Whatever it was he caught, death was near. The doctor said it was a miracle he made it. Years later, Kai told me about his time in the hospital. The delusions, the hysteria. His mind blurred sleep and waking. But the one constant was eyes. Yellow eyes. All around him. Max came out of the thicket with something in his mouth. At first, I thought it was another dog's toy. He had a habit of taking what wasn't his. His tail was down, but he held fast to whatever he discovered. I took it from him, commanding him until he finally obeyed and released it. It was a child's doll. It looked like some ancient relic from the early 20th century. It had the same dimensions and general aesthetic of a Raggedy Ann doll, but with a porcelain body, spider webs etched into its age-old skin, a shattered hole where one eye had once been, sawdust and mold spilled from inside it like an infection spreading outward. Max whined. I knew if I tossed it, he'd only chase it, so I took it with me back toward our house down the block, intending to throw it away there. The whole walk home, Max half-hopped and walked steadily at my flank, attentive in a way that felt wrong. When we reached the yard, I was ready to hand the doll back to him, if only to appease him for a moment. But when I offered it, he stepped back awkwardly, the way dogs do when they're trying to retreat without turning around. His tail was down, tucked between his legs, and he cried softly. I asked him what was wrong. He answered with a bark, loud, deep, nothing playful about it. Max had a personality, but the way he was acting was stranger than anything I'd seen before. I went inside and put the doll in the trash bin, and went to finish some chores. It was a few hours later when I noticed him lying stiffly, eyes fixed on the bin. I tried to call him away, offered treats, even an early dinner. He didn't move. When my wife got home with the kids, they scattered into their usual routines. My son Jack had recently become infatuated with video games. My daughter Liza is 6 years old and hosts tea parties for her toys. I grew up in suburbs like these, playing in the woods, building forts in the summer. In the fall, we'd rake massive piles of leaves and jump from low branches into them. In winter, sledding and snowball fights. I seldom see my kids leave the comfort of the house, let alone venture outside. Sure, there are fewer scraped knees and broken bones, but I worry they're growing up soft. I know how that sounds. I don't push that worldview onto them. I just want them to play outside, with kids their age. Hell, get into some trouble, but get out of the house. My wife and I bought this place because we wanted to give them a normal childhood. There's a stretch of woodland just past the cul-de-sac that goes on for miles and miles. Wetlands cut through it, thick with skunk cabbage and mosquitoes. But if you can see past the smell and the bites, it's the kind of place that should inspire a kid's adventure. I've been saying all this to my wife, Sue. She agreed that they spent too much time inside, but she also pointed out the reality of things. Kids don't go outside like they used to. We don't live in an age where you ring a friend's doorbell and ask if they can come out and play. So we tried something else. We called it the outside experiment. Forced outdoor time, 2 hours a day. No gadgets and no devices. And no instructions. They had to figure out how to entertain themselves. They hated it. The first few days, they sat sullenly on the front porch, kicking rocks, pouting. Liza cried because she said she'd left her friends behind. But one afternoon, I looked out the window and saw them tossing a rubber ball back and forth in the yard. They were slowly coming around to it. I figured they might even thank us one day. I was part of the neighborhood HOA, mostly because I like knowing what's going on with our dead-end street. It's not much work. Nice neighborhood. People follow the few rules there are. I mentioned our outside experiment at a committee meeting, and a few neighbors also latched onto the idea. Before long, other kids were outside too. It was the best thing that could have happened. Jack started staying out past the required time, coming home when the streetlights came on. Liza at first drifted. There were more boys Jack's age than kids she could relate to. But eventually she told us that she made friends of her own and started exploring the woods behind the cul-de-sac. She came home thrilled, muddy, scraped, beaming, full of stories. One evening, I went into Liza's room to say goodnight and noticed something odd. She was having a tea party with her dolls, but one of them didn't belong. It was the doll Max had found. Or it wasn't. It was similar, but not the same. Red hair instead of brown. The head intact, no hole where the eye should have been. Just a lumpy head the shape of a goose egg. The porcelain was still weather-worn and scarred, and age had taken its toll. I asked her where she'd found it. She said it was in the woods. I wanted to throw it away. It was old, dirty, and unsettling. I feared germs or her cutting herself and getting an infection. But I wouldn't. I didn't want to discourage her from being outside. If she'd found her own personal treasure in the bog, I wasn't about to steal that from her. That may have been a mistake. As the weeks of summer dragged on, the kids continued playing outside. Occasionally, I'd get off work early, and Sue and I would go for walks, trying to take in the last of the day's light. One afternoon, I was packing us a picnic. I looked out the kitchen window and saw Liza crossing into the marsh. Max barked after her. She had the doll tucked into the crook of her arm. She was alone. Thinking back, I realized I had never actually seen her with her playmates. She only told stories, nameless stories. I assumed she was going to meet them, but something about it felt wrong. A little girl heading into the woods by herself. I stepped onto the back porch and nearly called her name, but stopped. I didn't want to scare her. I didn't want to make her feel like she was doing something wrong. Sue wouldn't be home for a few hours. I decided to follow from a distance. I know how this sounds. A father secretly following his daughter. It sounds wrong even to me now. But I wasn't acting out of suspicion or anger. I was curious, concerned. Massive white oaks and birch trees formed small islands in the swamp, each surrounded by its own moat of putrid water. Someone, Liza and her friends or someone else, had laid rotting 2x4s between them to cross the quagmire. After a while, I realized how far she was going. I still hadn't heard or seen any other children. Eventually, after crossing a plethora of planks and venturing deeper into the woods, she stopped at a treehouse. Strange how it was placed, in the middle of the bog. It was old and rotten, dangerous looking. When I saw her climbing the ladder pegs, I nearly called out, but stopped myself. Kids will climb and some will fall. I was supposed to be observing and trusting. When she reached the top, she slipped through a moldy cotton sheet that served as an entryway. Inside, I heard laughter. It was muffled, but I could tell it was her and at least one other girl. I smiled, relieved. This was their hideaway, a place for stories and secrets. When I returned home, I went upstairs to shut off the lights. The kids had a habit of running up the electric bill. When I stepped into Liza's room, though, I felt something drop in my stomach. Her tea table was occupied, not by her regular toys, but by some dark congregation. Porcelain dolls, ancient and swamp-stained, each seated carefully in a chair. Her American Girl dolls were gone, replaced entirely by grotesque figures from another era. They didn't belong in that room of purple walls and white trim, those things. It all felt wrong, like watching a carpet stained in wine, choosing to ignore it. My thoughts ran wild. Voodoo and rituals. Nonsense thoughts, but persistent ones. The room felt heavy, changed with something I didn't understand. I ran downstairs and looked out toward the woods. Max paced anxiously at the edge of the yard, whining, refusing to cross the threshold where the grass gave way to forest. I changed my mind. I went back into the woods. I ran across the tar-stained planks, deeper yet into the swamp. I misstepped and sank nearly to my knee in muck, but kept going. The crossing felt longer than it had earlier. The day was bright, but no light seemed to penetrate the canopy. A faint fog lifted from the dead water, thick and sour. The darkness was tangible. This was a place from storybooks, where witches lived. I nearly reached the treehouse and followed the laughter from afar. I continued on, but the closer I got, the quieter the giggling seemed to become. Once I arrived, it was near silent, bar the faint sound of whispers. Was I discovered? The stranger, the interloper in a land of child fantasies. A moment of hesitation, but I began my climb to the top. A slat snapped beneath my weight. The structure's design made its rules clear. No adults allowed. I forced myself upward, sweat slick on my skin, 20 feet or more beyond the earth. The laughter began and trailed off and stopped as I neared the apex. I reached the top, I took a breath, and pulled the flap aside. Liza. She wasn't there. The room was crammed full, barely room for a single child to begin with. The walls were lined with shelves, a bin sat at the end of it. It was nearly overflowing. Dolls. Hundreds of dolls. And none of them welcomed me. Gam always had nameless candies in a glass bowl, and no amount of sucking or chewing could break them into any sort of edible form. I'd always spit them out into a tissue when she looked away, and pocket it to deal with later. Then she'd force another one on me, and the whole process was rinse and repeat. This was my weekend ritual, as my parents apparently wanted nothing to do with me after work was through. Gam used to tell stories about Grandpa Jackie and his service in World War II. She loved the suburb she lived in. She constantly reminded me that Jackie fought for this life, the American dream. She was all in on Americana. The buntings and flags made it look like 4th of July decorations year-round. Even during Christmas time, she would put up the tree and ornaments, but the patriotic symbols never came down. She always talked about Jackie, his stories, his courage. A tear would come to her eye. I never pried or asked questions. I didn't want to cause her any further grief than her own tellings already did. My Gam had a way with cooking. Whatever it was she made, it burned. She burned eggs, toast. Hell, she could probably find a way to burn ice water. But it wasn't all bad. Each Friday, our ritual was going to Blockbuster, and I could pick out any movie I liked, so long as it was PG. She followed rules, societal or otherwise, and parental guidance was something she took as seriously as the rule of law. She would knit on the love seat, and I'd sit on the floor watching whatever film I chose, picking through a bowl of burnt popcorn for the choice pieces. The film would drag on, and she'd drift off to sleep sitting up. I'd wake her and she'd go up to her room. A bed was set up for me in the spare bedroom on the first floor. The home was old and made sounds at night. Not the sounds of a modern home, but something ancient and unsullied. All the appliances were decades old, too heavy to bother moving. They would be hauled out when the house was torn down one day. The refrigerator would wheeze through the night. A cuckoo clock chimed and ticked to its heart's content. Then there were other sounds. Breathing from the nearby vent. It was an old home, even for Gam's age. The radiator and vents were stylized, embellished with intricate floral designs. I noticed a sound one night coming from the vent. A loud click, then a croaked breath pushing air through the metal. Then it would slowly dissolve into silence once more. But one night, late, the breathing sounded real. It was wheezing, labored, rattling. I remember getting so scared, I hid my head under the covers and blocked my ears with pillows. The next week I went back to Gam's. I remember this time vividly. It was my birthday weekend, so Gam let me pick 2 movies. I chose The Indian in the Cupboard and Jumanji. By the second feature, Gam was fast asleep. I heard the labored breathing again. I almost laughed to myself, assuming she was making all that noise. When the second film ended, it was well past my bedtime, and I went to wake her. That's when I noticed she was sleeping silently. The breathing was coming from the vent nearby. Then it gasped, like someone with sleep apnea jolting awake. Startled, I stepped back. That's when I heard a creak. It came from upstairs. I wanted to wake Gam, to ask her if she heard what I was hearing, but some strange part of me felt like she was in on it, that she knew what it was and kept it hidden from me. She turned in her sleep. That's when I realized I had never been upstairs in Gam's house before. It was a mystery what world lay above my head. She coughed herself awake. I was standing rigid, and she didn't seem to notice. She simply asked me what time it was, and we each went to bed. It was quiet after that, and somehow, I slept easily. The next morning, Gam went out to the store. She wanted to make me her famous birthday pancakes and needed buttermilk. I watched morning cartoons as I saw her car leave the driveway. I muted the television and sat, listening. It was quiet again. I checked out the window one more time and ventured toward the stairs. They were narrow, and the top was shrouded in darkness. Heavy drapes hung from the windows, and no light penetrated the upper floor. I crept up the stairs, the floorboards creaking even beneath the carpet. As I neared the top, something struck me. A smell. Burnt food. Yams, of course, but something rotten beneath it. Something sour and foul. I reached the hallway and didn't know what to do or where to go next. I opened Gam's door. Her bed was made. A vanity and dresser stood neatly against the walls, along with a shrine to Jesus. Crosses everywhere. Crosses and photos of her and my grandfather Jackie. Younger, happy, always smiling. One photo showed them in France, another in Italy. The scent of old woman's perfume stained the air. I stepped back into the hall, nearly turning around. Then I heard the breathing again. It wasn't coming from a vent now. It was muffled, like it was behind a wall. I opened each of the remaining doors, a closet, a bathroom, a spare bedroom full of junk. That's when I heard a metal creak, sharp, like pushing on springs. A string dangled from the ceiling, the attic access. At this point, my heart hammered against my chest. What was up there that Gam didn't want me to find? Then I heard a breath so clear it made me dizzy. It was wheezing, gurgling, like lungs full of fluid. I stood motionless, afraid to move, for what were likely minutes but felt like hours. Eventually, I decided I had to know what was in the attic. I pulled the string. The attic stairs dropped down soundlessly. A wave of putrid air followed, stronger now. It smelled of rot, feces, urine. My legs quivered as I climbed step by step, peeking my head inside. It was dark and mostly unfinished, aside from wooden panels laid flat atop the 2x4s. I heard the wheeze again. It was directly in front of me now, aimed toward me. I narrowed my eyes, trying to see past the darkness, trying to hear past the pounding in my ears. I stepped forward, and my foot sank into insulation. I nearly fell, but steadied myself on something cold and hard. It creaked. A bed frame. A gasping breath full of fluid rattled out in front of me. A beaded metal chain dangled nearby. A light. I pulled the cord. What I saw still haunts me. A cadaver. Emaciated skin and bone, eyes nearly hollow. It lay atop a mattress in its own filth. A mountain of plates piled with rotten food sat beside him. His body was stained, unmoving. The body was so thin, it looked folded in on itself. Joints swollen where the skin had been pressed too long against the mattress. The plates beside him weren't old in the way forgotten things are. They were arranged, stacked, but rotting all the same. His eyes were wide. They looked at me with such terror that it felt as though we had switched places. There was something in them that I didn't have the answer for. I stepped back, nearly falling off the entry ledge. I didn't scream. I was too scared to make a sound. I climbed down the ladder using only my hands. My legs wouldn't work. I closed the attic door, went back downstairs, and waited for Gam to come home. Somehow I made it through the rest of the weekend. Gam was chipper in her old ways. A few months later, we moved across the state. I didn't see Gam on weekends anymore. And they didn't find Jackie until Gam died in her sleep 2 years later. The paramedics noticed a sound coming from the vents. Kara and I were red in the face. Not quite rolling on the floor laughing, but laughing all the same. We hadn't had fun like this in years. I poured her another glass of wine as she sorted through the stack of envelopes, each one addressed to our house, but to varying names, different owners. Holiday cards and thank you notes were something we occasionally found a gem in, but pen pals and confessionals, while seldom seen, were where the real meat lay. This was our dark habit. We started doing it a few months prior, annoyed by the amount of mail we received. Mail that wasn't directed to us. It seemed as though no previous owner had ever set up mail forwarding. Each day, the mailman would come, and with him a stack of solicitous junk, layered with the occasional letter, notice, or bill bearing some other person's name. It began innocently enough. I was in a rush, opening a letter without reading the name on the slip. Inside was a tear-stained apology, one spouse to another, deeply personal. Kara and I had been going through a rough patch, and I saw something of us in that anecdote. I shared it with her, and we were both bewildered by the raw passion conveyed on the page. After we finished reading it, we burst out laughing. We were in good spirits the rest of the night. That feeling became something of an addiction. When things are bad for long enough, you'll take just about any good fortune sent your way, in whatever form it may be. Anyway, that's how it began. Over the course of the month, we'd round up the letters and place them in a basket. At the end of it, we'd open them over a couple bottles of wine, share laughs, and pick our favorites. I know it was invasive. I know it was wrong, but we kept doing it anyway. This is not an apology. I've learned that authoring your feelings will likely only result in laughter and ridicule from first-hand experience, so I'll keep this telling as objective as possible. This past month, we collected our share of letters, which for some reason were not reducing in frequency. If anything, we seemed to be receiving more missent mail than usual. Sure, much of it was from credit agencies and phone carriers, but there was a surprising amount of traditional mail. Letters sent from friends and family, loved ones, old classmates. It was fascinating, little glimpses into someone else's life. I suppose, truth be told, Kara and I were boring people. We didn't have many friends. Our own personal lives were mundane. We didn't attend social events or work mixers. We finished our jobs and came home to our little neighborhood, where we spent our nights reading, watching television, occasionally doing a puzzle. It was how we liked it. I opened another letter. It was from one Ben Johnson to Chase Tile Co. He was threatening legal action, a lien against the previous occupant, Richard O'Neill. I guess Richie didn't pay the bill and neglected to send his assailant a forwarding address. Kara snorted at this one. We were getting into the meat and potatoes of it, but this is usually where the needle in the haystack would appear. We continued tearing away at the letters, like wolves ravaging their victims. That's when one had me go silent. Kara immediately noticed the change. Her laugh trailed off as she asked, with newfound interest, what it was. I turned the letter toward her and watched the color drain from her face. It simply read, in large black ink, "I know what you're doing." She asked quietly who sent it. I pulled the envelope from the mountain growing beside the coffee table. It had our address, but no name. No return address either. That's about where the fun ended. The next morning, I stuffed the letters and torn envelopes into a garbage bag and brought it to work. It was full and actually heavy. That's how long we've been doing this. We'd only saved the ones we found most interesting. Just goes to show how a small joy can quickly get out of hand. I felt like a low-life criminal, destroying the evidence. I fed the heap of crumpled paper into the teeth of the industrial shredder. Something pained me as I did it, like I was destroying memories. Not just the pleasantries my wife and I shared, but someone else's memories as well. Memories that were never realized. At least that's how I chose to rationalize it. Perhaps I was just sad to see our little game come to an end. It had been about a week. I was watering the front lawn when the mailman came by with a wad of letters thicker than I'd ever seen. I had played the victim, contacting the post office several times about the mail we were receiving that clearly wasn't for us. I'm not sure how the process works, but one would think removing names from an address wouldn't be impossible. I told the mailman we would not be taking letters not addressed to us. He shrugged and placed the pile in the mailbox before I reached the end of the drive. I brought the mound inside, sorting through which were ours and placing the rest in a separate pile, trying not to let my curiosity run rampant. One was addressed to Kara and I. My last name, one I won't be writing here, was listed. A household name. Usually that meant junk mail, as Kara's family and my own tend to address letters to each individual. But this one had no return address. My heart pounding, I opened it. Inside was a full letter, handwritten by what appeared to be a child or some mindless oaf. The penmanship was near illegible, the style entirely alien. Each line was assailing, scarred into the notebook paper it was scribbled on. Whoever wrote it was angry.
I know what you did.
It started with that again, and I was already dizzy with dread, like being agitated by a stranger on the street. Then it continued, and my worst fears were realized and more.
I know it was you. I will not contact police. I will handle this. Alone. Do not run. I will follow. Yours truly.
And that was it. Just yours truly, with a comma in the middle. Was this person going by the alias Truly, or did they simply not understand sign-offs? Before I had time to mull it over, I phoned Kara, and she left work early. We sat at the dining room table, staring at the letters between us. It was silent for a long time. We knew we should call the authorities. The sender seemed to think they were the victim. A previous owner, perhaps, who had discovered we were reading their personal letters. It could have been a dozen different names, different people whose privacy we had invaded. I wish we could say we didn't know it was a crime, that we didn't understand knowingly opening someone else's mail was a felony. But there was a clear greater of two crimes here. Still, we didn't want to risk everything we'd worked for blowing up in our faces over some lighthearted fun. Was it lighthearted? I start to think about the hole we dug ourselves into. My mind kept returning to how they'd found out. We'd kept the mail. It entered our home and didn't leave. We opened it in the privacy of our living room. Did we always shut the blinds? Had someone watched us while we conducted our dark deed? The thought made me shiver. Kara cried quietly. She said we should get a hotel, list the house. We talked about downsizing anyway. Those thoughts had crossed my mind as well, but something about the demanding, confident, yet simpleton voice stood out to me. I will follow. They'd be able to find us if they wanted to. Everything is available online today. The thought nearly made me laugh, considering whether we would set up our own mail forwarding. We decided to do the right thing. No more letters. If this person was seeing red because we'd opened their mail, maybe they'd back off when they saw we'd lost interest. We decided on 2 rules. First, we would not open any letters not addressed to us. Second, if we noticed letters from our assailant, we would set them aside unopened, keeping them as evidence if needed. That week, the mailman came each day and delivered the letters. I gently placed those not addressed to us on the ground with a small rock on top so they wouldn't blow away. I retreated back into the house each time, looking over my shoulder, scanning the neighboring houses and the tree line for shadows and watchers. It was always quiet, always a pleasant day. We went on like this for weeks. We didn't receive another letter from our watcher. Kara and I were on edge, and when we're on edge, we argue. We reminded each other we needed to be a team, but it didn't make the stress any easier. I suggested we take a vacation, clear our heads. It had been years since our last getaway, and both of us had plenty of unused PTO. We packed our bags and flew to our timeshare in Bermuda for 6 nights. When we arrived, the dread lingered, the feeling of being watched. But by the second day, we relaxed. We spent our days and nights carefree, a brief return to our honeymoon phase. If only things could always be like that. On our last day, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt, but when I checked the peephole, it was only the bellhop. I let him in to load our bags, and he mentioned almost in passing that a letter had been left for us at the reception desk. Kara stood shell-shocked in the back of the room as he spoke. He placed the envelope in my hand, oblivious or indifferent to the dread on my face, then took our bags and left. I called after him. There was no return address, I said. He responded, it had been delivered by hand. That's when I ran. I pushed past the bellhop. Kara followed, walking quickly, trying not to draw attention. I slammed the elevator button over and over, and then decided to just take the stairs. Once I reached the lobby, I placed the letter on the front desk and demanded to know who had dropped it off. The receptionist was startled and said he wasn't sure. I asked for a manager. One arrived and tried to calm me down. I was alarming guests. Kara arrived moments later, moving as if in a dream. I asked for descriptions, for camera footage. After some back and forth, it became clear there would be no answers without involving the police. We sat in the lobby. I opened the envelope despite Kara's protest. We had rules, but I wanted answers. The message was short and to the point. You can't hide from the past. I screamed in anger. A fog overtook my vision. I'm sure the vacationers stared, but I didn't see them. I only stared at the letter. Kara placed a hand on my shoulder and looked down at it with me. When we arrived home, we felt anything but rested. Our mailbox was empty. I was almost relieved until I realized how wrong that was. Someone had taken our mail. All of it. We unlocked the house. I dropped the keys into the jar and rolled our bags into the mudroom. I collapsed into the recliner, hands over my eyes, a headache blooming behind them. That's when Kara called my name. I went into the kitchen. The table was empty. There were no piles or stacks, no careful arrangement of other people's lives. There was just one envelope. It sat alone at the center of the table, squared neatly with the edges, as if it had been measured. The handwriting was the same, ugly and deliberate. Our household name was written on the front. The house was old, the oldest in the neighborhood. It stood alone and proud among the brutalist 3-story houses that had recently begun swallowing up the surrounding block. Part of that pride was the noise. Every squeak of a mouse carried through the structure, no matter the day, no matter the hour. But this sound was different. It wasn't the hollow clank of a pipe, or the slow complaint of wooden panels adjusting to temperature. It was intentional. Knocking. I rose, pulled on my robe and loafers, and began the slow climb down the narrow stairway. I peered through the curtains, but no one was there. Once disturbed, sleep doesn't return easily at my age. So I went into my office and sat at the desk, waking the computer from its own rest. The screen flared to life, bright and abrasive. I squinted as my eyes adjusted. I spent 30 minutes or so answering emails and doing light research for the article I was writing. The room remained quiet and undisturbed. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, stretching as far as the frame would allow and yawning. That's when I heard the knock again. I nearly tipped backward, catching myself on the edge of the desk. Cranky and irritated, I rushed to the front door and swung it open. Somewhere else this might have been a foolish instinct, but my mind went to children's pranks rather than home intruders. It was a well-to-do part of town, a gated community no less. No one was there. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the hedges and shadows, looking for whoever had been out there. Then I stepped back inside, muttering to myself, closing the door, still peering through the narrow slot windows beside it. Then it happened again. Knocking, but not from the front door. It came from somewhere else, somewhere inside the house. A sudden wave of nausea rolled through me. I moved quickly up the stairs and into the bedroom, pulling a dust-covered case from beneath the bed, one I had nearly forgotten I still owned. Inside lay the Glock 17, unmoved from where I'd left it years earlier. I held it out in front of me as I descended the steps again, each one creaking loudly underfoot. I stood still in the foyer. The house was nearly silent except for my own heartbeat and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then the knock came again, louder this time. It startled me so badly I nearly dropped the gun, fumbling it in my hands. I shouted, cursing, not to myself, but to whoever was doing this, demanding they leave immediately. I tried to follow the sound, to determine where it was coming from, and that's when it occurred to me that I should be calling the police. I turned toward the kitchen, where my only landline was still connected. As I approached, the knocking came again, but farther away, behind me. I rushed back toward the entryway near the clock and stood there, waiting. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Eventually, minutes became hours, and the sun began to rise. I watched the hands of the clock glide forward and heard nothing else. It seemed as though the terror had ended. I worked throughout the day on caffeine and the occasional cigarette, just enough to keep myself upright and focused long enough to finish the article before its deadline. The piece examined a real estate company buying up land across the town in massive swaths. Cheap developments were spreading outward like a virus, consuming neighborhoods whole. Many of my own neighbors had already sold, folded for a paycheck. I had received offers myself. Mail, phone calls, even emails. I'd made it clear I wasn't interested. That afternoon, there was another knock. This time, it came from the door. I swung it open to find a man in a suit and tie holding a briefcase. He introduced himself as a representative of the very company I'd been writing about. I knew that before he said it. They all wore the same wolfish smile. I said some unsavory things, only half of what I really felt, and watched as he retreated down the steps, still smiling. I stopped him, demanding they never come back to my house again, especially not in the early hours of the morning. He looked genuinely confused by this, said nothing, and walked away. That's when the thought occurred to me. Did they know? Did they know what I was writing? The idea sounded paranoid, but paranoia often wears the mask of reason when you understand how certain people operate. That afternoon, I drove into town and paid an obscene amount of money to have security cameras installed, covering every angle of the exterior of my home. No blind spots. When they finished, I felt foolish, safe, and vaguely criminal all at once. The house I had worked so hard to preserve, restoring only what was necessary, was now littered with modern surveillance equipment. It felt like a betrayal. Still, if someone wanted to knock on my door in the middle of the night, I intended to know who it was. That evening, I made final revisions and sent the article off. Whatever happened from here on out, it didn't matter because I'd have my last word. The gun sat beside me on the desk as the hours crawled by. I couldn't read, I couldn't watch television. My attention remained fixed on the entryway, waiting, expecting. At some point, I woke up. I didn't remember falling asleep. I was sitting upright on the couch with a stiff ache in my neck. What woke me wasn't the pain. It was the knock. I stood, reaching instinctively for the gun. It wasn't there. I checked the desk. Nothing. Something was wrong. The knocking returned, louder now, violent. I ran to the kitchen as it came again and again. Closer together this time, fumbling with the phone as I dialed 911. My hands shook so badly I nearly missed the numbers. Before I could finish, a knock thundered through the house, louder than anything I'd ever heard. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, the dial tone humming faintly in the background. I stood there, frozen. Thoughts crept in, things I had never believed in. Poltergeists, residual hauntings, the fringe of the world I'd always dismissed. But in that moment, the hair stood up along my neck, and time seemed to stall completely. When I moved again, it was quiet. I returned to my office and pulled up the camera feeds. No alerts, no motion detected. I scrubbed through the footage again and again, but nothing. There was no figure or ominous shadow, no explanation. If whatever was knocking was still here, it had never left. It had always been inside the house. This was a mistake. I should have finished dialing the police. I should have left. Instead, I did the one thing I shouldn't have. I knocked back. Standing in the hallway, I raised my fist and rapped hard against the wall, striking until my knuckles ached, an act of defiance. Then I waited. Silence. But then softly came the response. A knock, distant and quiet. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to feel the vibration, to locate it. And then I understood. The knock came from inside the wall. I sold the house not long after, not to the encroaching company, but to a family willing to pay my asking price. I didn't make as much money as I should have. Maybe they'll renovate. Maybe they'll hold out. Or maybe one night, they'll hear the same knocking and take the offer I refused.